What's up, Dirt Junkies? I am always on the lookout for affordable backpacking quilts, and typically I've been very pleased with the performance of the quilt for the price I've paid. But I've got to tell you that this quilt is an absolute and unfortunate exception to that experience. Before I tell you why I say that about this Sierra Designs Nitro 20, let me tell you what reeled me in about this quilt, and also tell you that at the end I'll tell you what I would recommend in the same price range instead that is much, much better. When I first found this quilt online, it was on sale for $150 on Amazon. It came with great ratings and had a lot going for it. It has a 20-degree EN standard temperature rating, uses hydrophobic 800 fill power goose down, and is nice and light at 1 pound, 11 ounces. It also has some unique features that really interested me, and comes from a brand that I haven't tried anything from yet, but had heard good things about. So for $150 on sale, I went for it. And when I first received the quilt, I was pretty happy with what I saw and felt. First, upon opening the box, I could see that it had been stored in a mesh storage sack rather than the stuff sack, which is always a good idea because it prevents the down from being crushed, which can unfortunately prevent some of your quilt baffles from filling out and give you major cold spots, especially on a cold weather quilt, which this should be. It's advertised as a 20-degree quilt and boasts an EN rating. When I first picked it up, it felt small and light, which was fantastic. That's what we all want with backpacking gear, as long as it performs as expected. Now, when I pulled it out of the mesh storage sack, that's when I noticed a few things that started to concern me about this quilt. First, without even holding it up to the light, I could tell that there were some major empty spots as far as down is concerned. But I didn't panic. I know this can especially happen when you have a new quilt that's been in storage for a while. The nice thing is you can move down around within a quilt or a sleeping bag, so I worked on doing that and then let it loft up for 48 hours before I used it because it had been in storage. The other thing I immediately noticed and was concerned about is that there are no straps on this quilt. Now, if you're not familiar with backpacking quilts, you might not know that quality quilts will come with straps, or at least loops for straps on the bottom. Those straps allow you to attach the quilt to your sleeping pad, which prevents it from moving around and keeps those sides tucked in under you, which is especially important with cold weather quilts. Because it's not sewn all the way up like a sleeping bag, you want to make sure that the sides of that quilt really stay down to keep the warm air in as you sleep. This quilt came with no straps, no loops for straps, or anything else, which was a disappointment in this price range. As I mentioned already, I did let the quilt loft up for 48 hours before using it to really give that down time to puff up and insulate me from the cold. And then I set it up in my tent on a night that the forecast was 27 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a little bit colder than the comfort rating of 32 degrees, but I tend to sleep quite warm and would be wearing warmer base layers than usual, hat, gloves, socks, and even a neck gaiter. So I figured this quilt would be just fine, especially because it was an EN rating, which we should all give more weight to when we're talking about sleeping bags. What I didn't realize at the time is that quilts actually don't have any official EN rating criteria. Those criteria were created for sleeping bags, and quilts just don't have any sort of standard criteria. I can only assume that Sierra Designs tried to replicate the criteria for testing sleeping bags with this quilt. I'm not really sure how well that would work, given that there aren't any straps on here, no hood, other things like that, but something important to know is that if you see a quilt that is EN rated, as far as I can tell, it doesn't actually mean anything. So, how was sleeping in the Sierra Designs Nitro 20? When I went to bed at 10:41 p.m., it was already 26 Fahrenheit outside, 1 degree colder than it was forecasted to get. So I knew it was likely to get a few degrees colder than that as the night went on. But as I said, I wasn't worried. I had a nice warm sleeping pad set up. I had my nice heavy base layers, socks, hat, gaiter, gloves, and an EN rated quilt. I climbed in the quilt, tucked in the sides underneath me as best I could without any straps, and then went to sleep. The first thing I remember is waking up at 3:30 a.m. and I was cold. I checked the thermometers and the outside temperature was 24 degrees, so it had dropped 2 degrees since going to bed. Inside the tent was 32 degrees. This was a double-walled tent, so it doesn't surprise me at all that the temperature within the tent was a little bit warmer than outside. I should mention that at this point, if I was on an actual backpacking trip, I would have pulled my down coat in with me and put it over the top of my chest as another insulating layer. But I really wanted to test this quilt out in these conditions, so I just tried to go back to sleep as best I could. Since there weren't any straps and I could tell that the size of the quilt had really fallen out from underneath me, I figured the best move might be to turn onto my stomach, really try and tuck those sides in underneath me, and then also try out these mitten things on top because I could tuck those underneath my pillow and then really try and hold those sides of the quilt in. I figured if the quilt was going to work, this was probably the only way. I managed to get back to sleep, but then just 2 hours later, at 5:30 a.m., I was so cold. I checked the temperature again and it had dropped 1 more degree to 23 Fahrenheit, but it was still 32 in the tent. I found the thermometer in my quilt and was surprised by the huge temperature swings. The max recorded temperature was 83, which is probably a time when it was right next to my body or even between my body and the sleeping pad, and the low temperature recorded was 43 degrees. That is cold for inside a quilt or a sleeping bag. I'm positive that it wasn't that temperature everywhere, because otherwise I would have been shivering uncontrollably and would have given up and gone inside long ago. But I also know that the thermometer never fell off of my sleeping pad. Each time I woke up, when I went to find it, it was somewhere within my quilt. So if it was 43 degrees somewhere in my quilt, that is just not okay. Way too cold for inside of my quilt or on top of my sleeping pad. At this point, I had decided that I had tested this quilt sufficiently to know that I was not comfortable using in these conditions, and although I usually try to stick these tests out until at least 6 a.m., laying there and shivering for 30 minutes did not sound fun. So I got up, went inside, and went to bed in my bed. So obviously not a great experience with the Sierra Designs Nitro 20, and it goes without saying that I do not recommend buying this quilt. But before I tell you what I would recommend, let me just summarize why the Sierra Designs Nitro 20 I do not think is a good option. Even if it had sufficient insulation to keep me warm to the temperatures that I tested it to, which admittedly is slightly below the recommended comfort rating, there are enough other things about this quilt that I wouldn't even want it in warmer temperatures. The big one for me is no straps. Any quilt, especially over $100, $150, $200, the current price on Amazon, should come with pad straps. Before you buy any quilt, check and see if there's pad straps. At least that's my rule. I know there are some nice warm weather quilts that don't have straps, but you're not trying to stay warm down and below freezing temperatures. If you're trying to stay warm in cold weather, you need pad straps. There's also no cinch around the shoulders or the neck area, which maybe they tried to make up for with the insulated mittens on the corner, which I thought was a cool idea, but just really didn't work in principle. This, don't do it, just don't do it. You're gonna breathe all this condensation into your quilt, it's gonna be wet, it's gonna be cold. Just don't do it. It's just expensive and lacks a lot of the features that I've come to expect in even much less expensive quilts. So, enough about the Sierra Designs Nitro 20, which, by the way, 20 degrees is the extreme EN rating, not the comfort rating. Let me tell you what I would recommend instead. Now, if you're looking at the Sierra Designs Nitro 20, it's out of here, you probably want a quilt that's going to keep you warm down to freezing temperatures. This is the Paria Thermodown 15. It also comes in a 30-degree version. It's a quilt. I know they have a bag by the same name. This is the quilt, and I love it. You can pick up the 15 degree, which is the one I have, for $180, less than the list price of the Sierra Design Nitro 20, and you can pick up the 30 degree version for $160. So the Paria Thermodown quilts are both cheaper than the Sierra Designs, and you can even go colder down to 15 degrees. It's also worth noting that Paria has mentioned their ratings should be a comfort rating. They do acknowledge that there are variations as far as who's warm down to what temperatures, but the temperature ratings they give to their quilts, which they don't say are EN tested, should be the comfort ratings, and that has been true to my experience. I did sleep in this quilt with the exact same sleep setup just one night before the Sierra Designs Nitro 20. And let me tell you, I had a much better experience. When I went to bed on the night I slept in this quilt, it was 28 degrees Fahrenheit when I went to bed around the same time, so 1 or 2 degrees warmer Fahrenheit than the Sierra Designs test. The first time I woke up was 4:15 in the morning, and I was toasty, even though it was 25 degrees outside. When I checked the thermometer inside my quilt, the current temperature it was reading at was 81 degrees. It said there was a high of 91 and a low of 73. Again, those higher temperatures, 81, 91, is probably when it was right between my body and the pad, but the fact that the low in there was 73, remember the low with the Sierra Designs was 48, tells me that this quilt was working much better. And the temperature outside was only 2 degrees different. I went back to sleep and didn't wake up until almost 7 a.m. I usually get up at 6. That seems to be the standard time that I wake up when I'm backpacking. But I was so comfortable, so warm in this Thermodown 15-degree quilt, I slept in. That's how well I slept. When I checked the temperature, it had gotten down to 24, so only 1 degree warmer than when I tested the Nitro 20. And I was so much warmer in the Paria Thermodown 15. Again, it also comes in a 30-degree version, and I have full confidence that I'd have the same experience. But even the 15-degree is cheaper than the Sierra Design. So if you really want to go cold, just get the 15-degree Thermodown. Let me tell you some other features about this fantastic quilt. First, it comes with, imagine this, pad straps. These are fantastic. They do a great job of not only attaching it to the pad, but also making it possible to tuck it underneath your sides, so you're not losing cold air that way in your sleep. It also has a cinch cord around your shoulders, as well as a snap that you can put around your neck. When I go to sleep and it's cold, I always just snap that behind my neck, but I'll wait to do the cinch cord until I maybe get cold, and that really helps hold in the warm air. I should tell you that this quilt also has an open foot box, which means that there's more cinch cords down there, and you can also fully unzip the quilt if you'd like to. Some people are concerned about a draft coming in from this hole in the foot box. I personally have never experienced that. There have been a few trips where I've taken a pair of socks and put it in the bottom of my quilt so that I can plug that hole just in case, but it's actually never been a problem. I should also mention that the insulation is duck down, which I think doesn't quite have the same warmth to weight ratio as goose down, but this quilt was warmer. As far as weight goes, the 30-degree Paria Thermodown quilt comes in at 2 pounds. The 15-degree comes in heavier than the 30-degree version at 2 pounds 3 ounces, which would be 9 ounces heavier than the Sierra Designs. So you are carrying some additional ounces with this one, but it's also just much warmer, which is what you want out of a 30-degree or a 20-degree bag. I should also mention that you can get the Paria Thermodown quilts in a long version. It says that the regular is for people up to 5'11". I'll tell you, I'm 6 feet tall. I bought the regular version. It works just fine for me. But if you're taller than that, I would definitely recommend going with the long. So if you're looking for an affordable backpacking quilt to keep you warm down to freezing, even below freezing, my recommendation is the Paria Thermodown either 30-degree or 15-degree quilt. And I'll include links to both down in the description below. If you're looking for something even a little bit more affordable than that, check out this video right here where I compare 3 backpacking quilts, all less than $100. And remember, life is better with some dirt in it.